everybody. So today we're going to talk about failures, what they look like, how to prevent them, and how to stay safe. My name is Ronnie Chen, and I'm a technical diver. My first childhood memory is being on a tiny rowboat in a lake when I was about 2 years old. And I stood up to reach for some seaweed in the water, and I leaned over and I fell in. And then there's nothing but darkness. I don't actually know what happened after I started choking, but I almost drowned that day. And I've had a healthy fear of the water for all of my life. And diving gave me a way to overcome that nervousness, because now I was no longer dependent on the surface for my air. As long as I obeyed certain rules, I was free to explore. And to help myself become more comfortable, I pursued more and more training. First, I got my advanced certification, and then rescue, and then technical training. In my first year, I did almost 200 dives. I was getting certified to go on deeper dives, and I was learning how to safely explore shipwrecks far below the depths of recreational scuba limits. And then I bought a rebreather. A rebreather purifies and recycles the air that you're exhaling, so you waste less gas. And this is the same technology that you'll see in spacesuits. You have a portable gas blending device on your back that you mix on the fly to keep yourself alive. And using this, I was able to do even deeper and longer dives than I did before. At 100 meters, or 330 feet under the surface, you're at 10 atmospheres of pressure. If you head up immediately upon hitting the bottom, you need to do about 25 minutes of decompression at various depths before you can safely surface, or else you're risking severe injury or even death. And the longer you stay down there, the longer that time increases. Which means you can no longer rely on swimming to the surface as a means of safety if something goes wrong. At 300 feet under the water and several miles offshore, you're hours from the surface and a long helicopter ride away from emergency medical support. So one of the definitions of technical diving is diving that has these additional challenges above and beyond what you would do on a fun dive. Longer dives, a hard overhead ceiling like being in a cave or a shipwreck, or a soft ceiling, such as a decompression obligation that prevents you from going to the surface. The gear that we use can involve 6 or more tanks weighing over 200 pounds. This is a dramatic increase in the number of complicating factors that you need to stay alive. This is just a sample of the things that could go wrong while diving on a rebreather. I'm just going to read them. Hypoxia, too little oxygen. Hyperoxia, too much oxygen. Nitrogen narcosis, carbon dioxide buildup. Oxygen sensor failure. Deep tissue isobaric counterdiffusion. High pressure nervous syndrome. Exhausting your carbon dioxide scrubber. Carbon dioxide channeling on a poorly packed scrubber. Carbon buildup causing a spark that leads to an oxygen fire underwater. Flooding of your breathing loop or circuitry. Water mixing with your scrubbing agent that produces a toxic caustic soda that can give you chemical burns on your mouth, airways, and lungs. And just plain old decompression sickness, which can bring on muscle pain, vertigo, nausea, breathing difficulties, aka the chokes, paralysis, internal bleeding, and of course, death. Remember, you can't swim to the surface if you have a problem, so your survival depends on fixing it at depth. Jill Heinerth is one of the foremost underwater explorers in the world. And this quote is from a talk that she gave on rebreather safety when I first started tech diving. If you own a rebreather for 5 years, 2% of you are going to die on it. That's 1 person out of 50 in just 5 years. It's an incredibly sobering statistic. So what can you do when you're faced with odds like that? Well, you make a dive plan, you calculate your resource usage, you add in buffers for safety, and you take a written copy of this on you in case your dive computer dies. You run every dive with 2 independent sources of breathing gas, so if something goes wrong, you can bail out your system. You test the function of your critical components with checklists, You verify that your backups are fully functional. And you run through scenarios with your team and talk about contingency plans if something goes wrong during the dive. In other words, you plan your dive and you dive your plan. Now hang on just a second. It's starting to sound like I'm giving you a talk on communication and process. I lured you in here with the promise of cool stories about underwater exploration and diving. But what you're actually getting are my thoughts about best practices when dealing with complex systems. So let's talk about how to do that, how to survive. The first thing that we need to talk about is how failures really happen. We tend to think that failures happen because someone did something wrong, a single solitary catalyst that causes a failure to happen. But that's a really harmful way to think about failures. Because complex systems are designed to prevent against that, right? We have redundant systems, we create backups, we conduct operations as a team. In diving, just like in engineering, a single failure should never be resulting in catastrophe, because we already know that failures are going to happen. And yet, accidents do still happen. Here we have an example of a failure cascade in diving. You start off with a rebreather malfunction, which, if you were testing your gear on a regular basis, you would have caught. And your backup air supply has a leak, and it's running low, and that wasn't caught either. And your dive buddy is too far away, and they're not checking in with you. The dive light that you use to signal to get their attention at a distance is out of power. In all of this excitement, you kick up some silt from the bottom, and the visibility drops. So now you're stressed, and your air consumption goes up, and you breathe through the last of the air in your tank. And at this point, you swim for the surface because you don't see any other options, but you still have a decompression obligation. These are small individual failures that all allow the cascade to continue. And a change in any of these steps could have stopped that cascade in its tracks. Which means in our scenario, at least 8 different things had to go wrong for this critical accident to occur. And if you had done a post-mortem that said, this was caused by a simple rebreather malfunction, you would only cover 12.5% of all of the issues that led up to this accident. So it's really important that we try to understand how failures happen and how all of those factors combine to make it all possible. Not just the initial trigger that started it, but all of the events that allowed that failure to continue to cascade. All of the safety procedures that were supposed to stop the failure from cascading. And that brings me to the #1 rule of safety procedures. If they're not used as part of your standard operating procedure, they don't actually exist. And that sounds a little obvious and simplistic. Why am I talking about this? In fact, there's a term called the normalization of deviance. Astronaut Mike Mullane describes it as that natural human tendency, especially in a pressure circumstance or stressful situation, to take a safety shortcut. When we do something to bypass that safety framework that we've built, that's a safety shortcut. And what happens that first time that you take a safety shortcut? The first time that you edited a config setting directly on production? To be honest, probably nothing happened. So what did you learn from that? How does that affect your judgment? That experience reinforced the idea that your shortcut was okay, so you're more likely to do it again. And especially if you're stressed, especially if you're rushed. So soon, that shortcut is the way that you always do it. If you have a checklist, you start skipping items that you just know are okay. You start ignoring things, and then you start taking more shortcuts elsewhere. And if this continues, your rules start getting ignored so often that your sense of what is acceptable risk and what is not starts to get skewed. Your judgment becomes unreliable, and your risk detection burns out. And this creates pressure for everyone around you to start operating based on these degraded processes. And at that point, the only thing that's keeping you from failure is luck. And we all know that sooner or later that luck is going to run out. So that's why rule number 1 is if you stop using it, it doesn't exist. Number 2, an untested safety system also doesn't exist. If you have a safety procedure that you rely on and you don't test it, as your system evolves, the configurations that used to work may no longer be appropriate. I use oxygen sensors on my rebreather to adjust my breathing gas, so it's set at a mix that can sustain human life. If it's not properly calibrated, those readings that I'm getting are useless, and calibrations can drift over time. If the oxygen mix is too low, I can pass out. If the oxygen mix is too high, I could have a seizure. So the component is no longer providing that safety functionality that it was created, but it gives me the appearance of safety. I have a reading, and I'm inclined to rely on it. That incorrect sensor reading can lure me into a dangerous situation. So components in a complex system are drifting over time, and they can end up in an unsafe state, even if they were confirmed to be safe when you implement it, at the time that you set it up. And that leads us to a logical conclusion that unused and untested safety systems can be more dangerous than not having one at all. If you don't have one, you know the risks. If you're relying on something that's broken, that doesn't work anymore, that you haven't tested, you don't actually know what's going to happen. And the worst time to realize that your safety system has failed is when you're counting on it to stop that failure cascade from proceeding. So build your safety systems, and then test them, and keep testing at regular intervals so you know they're still working. And the length of this interval should be determined not only by how likely it is that your system is going to fail, but also the impact if it does. And the reason we talk about that is because usually when we talk about risk, we talk about what are the chances, what are the odds. But another way to look at risk is how great your regret is going to be if it happens. And if you are only evaluating risk based on chance, you have to be prepared to experience the corresponding level of regret. So when I'm diving, things that affect my airflow, if you're working on a production system, things that affect your normal operations, your production data, these are things that have to be protected even if the chances are low because the regret is so high. Because if there's one thing that we know for sure, it's that failures are going to happen. Complex systems are really chaotic and they're filled with interdependencies. For example, you're writing data to a messaging system, and a data blob gets so large that you can't ingest it. So you write an error message instead. Really reasonable, right? We've all done that. Earlier, when you were writing error messages, you thought, well, I want to help debug this, so I'm going to log the contents of the failed write. Reasonable, right? And you put them together, and what happens is that a single message that's too large is going to create an error message that's also too large. And that's going to create an error message that's too large, and so on. And so two decisions that were independently reasonable have now combined to take down your entire messaging service. So as your system is growing, it develops all of these entanglements that could be really difficult for a single person to understand. So what does that even mean to have safety in a complex system? We can't guarantee that failures aren't going to happen, and we can't just play whack-a-mole, hitting each individual failure when they pop up. What we're really talking about here is a state where we manage our failures. And this is what I promised you on the title slide. And it took us 34 slides to get here, but here we are. So failure management, we're talking about not only building this framework for resiliency, those backups, those restores, the testing, but also the training and the judgment to use that. And when you put these elements together, you're not just reacting to a failure when it happens. You're containing them, and you're providing a path for self-rescue before they can create that failure cascade. So, this framework that we're talking about, if you can't live without it, you need a backup. Those systems where that magnitude of regret is just too high. You carry extra air tanks. You make database backups. These are steps you just can't skip. And if it's not critical to survival or mission success, you plan a way to work around it, and you test that plan and make sure that it works. And your goal is the graceful degradation of services that can incorporate the new state of the system into your operations. And you want a process for that transition, and you want to test that as well. Your goal here is to limit the impact that a single failure can have before it kicks off that cascade. And you want to construct your system so that it's easier to do the right thing or to do nothing than to do something really dangerous. And if you do these things, it reduces the amount of chaos in your system and make it easier to reason about, make it easier to explore, and make your failures smaller and more contained. Okay, so that's that framework for resiliency part. What about the training and the judgment? This is the part that's a lot trickier, because being a human is hard. Humans they get tired, they get distracted, they make decisions based on emotions, frustration, anger. We need our systems to protect us from ourselves. And training and judgment is the basis for increasing the resiliency in those human systems, the teams of people. And one of the first things that you need to do is to train people for pressure. Because pressure makes people worse at carrying out even the most basic tasks. One of my first tech training drills combined a very standard out-of-air situation with a buddy with running a safety line. Two simple tasks that I'm already comfortable with conducting independently. And if you put them together, all of a sudden, during this drill, I hit my cognitive load. I was at depth. All of these things were happening. I thought I was just going to do one thing, and the instructor throws something else at me. This person comes up, and they need air. So I hand them my regulator. But when I'm doing that, what's happening with my other hand that's running the reel? I've released the tension. The line is now loose, and it's catching on my fins. Wait, what am I breathing right now when I handed over my regulator? Oh, my backup. Catch my breath. Meanwhile, my buddy is swimming one way. I'm headed the other. I'm tangled in the line. And my air gauge just keeps dropping because I'm stressed out and I'm breathing hard. In fact, my air consumption tripled during that exercise. Human beings are terrible at predicting how stress can overload our puny little brains. We think, I can do one thing and I can do another thing. So obviously, I know how to put them together. And that's just not true. But we practiced that drill a few times, and then it was just simple. Is it over? Put it in. Keep going. When that pressure is on, when you're on call, when you're managing an outage, having that muscle memory and having that experience frees up capacity in your brain. It's kind of like having microservices for your body. Your hands, your fingers, they know what to do, and your brain is saving CPU for key decision making. So don't wait for a failure to test your recovery plan. Actually do the run-throughs. And that not only gives you an understanding of the limits of the system and puts everything into practice, you're raising your own capacity to act smoothly when the pressure is on. Now, a strategy that we use a lot in dive training is having the least experienced person lead the dive. The whole team prepares together, but the person actually leading the mission, the person who's swimming in front, is the least experienced person of the group. And when I give this talk, this is the suggestion that makes people the most uncomfortable. And if that's describing one of you, I want you to lean into that discomfort a little bit and see why that makes you feel so nervous. When you operate in this way, it becomes very clear that the best way for the mission to succeed is for all of the members of the team to succeed. And that's what we're actually doing in software, right? Leave no one behind. If the most experienced person is in front, it's really easy to leave someone behind without meaning to. But if you put them up front, they're learning, they're growing, and they're operating with a safety net. And do you know what happens when your least experienced person is as comfortable leading the dive as the most experienced person? You both get to do harder dives. because you've raised the overall competency level of the entire team. Things that you thought only you could do and you had to pay attention to and only your cognitive load could handle, you can now pass off to other people. So you're doing harder things because you've helped your team along. If you fail to lift the newcomers up, you do everything yourself. You're a single point of failure, and you're actually anchoring the team behind. But if you equalize that gap, you're all doing more things faster, sooner, safer. And doing this gives you insight into parts of the system that are confusing, that are not poorly documented, that are not hardened against human error. Those things where you're like, ooh, if I let someone new take over that, they don't know this. Well, maybe you should write that down. This is where you discover all of the systems lore that isn't documented. All of those assumptions, all of that knowledge that just lives inside your own head that you never shared with someone else. When you put someone else in the lead position, you get to see what those are. And also, giving less experienced people the authority to make decisions is helping them to build good judgment. You give them feedback and support, and that helps to fine-tune their judgment. Because in a complex system, this judgment is the best weapon that you have against failure. The training that we do gives you a solution to a known problem. This happens, this is what we do. When you understand the reasoning behind it, you've built yourself a toolkit to solve categories of problems. You can start making nuanced decisions that can better fit your individual circumstance. And we need lots of tools to develop better judgment in order to make better decisions. A lot of divers and a lot of engineers are already doing an informal version of this. We sit around and we swap war stories. We talk about that horrible day or that horrible week. And we do this to increase understanding of what kinds of things go wrong. It's not just bragging. It's about what can go wrong, what can happen, what can we do? What is my thought process? Was that right? Was that wrong? You're refining the decision-making skills when you're in the moment. And so let's formalize this. You probably are all doing postmortems, right? And remember, when you're doing this, if you focus on the single person, a single event that triggered that failure, you're ignoring the bulk of the problem. Look for the safety procedures that didn't happen to stop that cascade, the ones that didn't work, or the ones that you never wrote in the first place. Look at all of the safety frameworks. Your goal for a postmortem is to gain a better understanding of your system, a better understanding of how to address the weak points of that. And if you're not doing that, what you've done is postmortem theater. It's just for show. You also don't have to wait for that failure to happen to start doing this kind of work. You can do a pre-mortem to surface concerns that you have and to start making contingency plans before you start doing that risky deploy. Before a dive, we talk about the risks in play. We talk about how we offset them. What happens if I have to abort a dive early? What happens if the dive runs long because we had a malfunction or something happened? What happens if the dive site is deeper than we thought? If this rollout takes 8 hours to run on all of your servers and something goes haywire 30 minutes in, what are your options? Talking about these mitigation strategies helps to reinforce that safety mindset. It doesn't have to be super formal, but start thinking about these things ahead of time. Experienced engineers learn to start doing this, but making it a conscious part of your practice, again, reinforcing that safety mindset. Remember what I said earlier about testing your safety systems or they don't exist? Running a fire drill is a way to prove that those systems, those procedures are still functional, that they still apply to the state of the system that it's in right now. A basic level drill could just be running through a plan or run book, making sure that everything does what it claims, the commands are still the same. You can even script them as part of regular operations. But for more complexity, you can designate an arsonist that's actually creating failures. And you can see how your system responds to it. Do you have the monitoring and alerting to tell you that things are failing? Can you diagnose the issue correctly based on what you have set up right now? Are your tools and documentation sufficient to resolve the issue? And again, start off on test environments before you start doing this stuff on prod. When we look back and reflect on our actions, we tend to restrict it to post-mortems only. A failure happened, and now we look at it. But it's also really important to look at things where nothing went wrong. What judgment did you use? What key decisions did you make that helped you towards your success? What key decisions did you make that could have gone horribly wrong, but you got really, really lucky? Survivorship bias means that we tend to assume that if nothing bad happened, our judgment was sound. I'm going to do it the same way next time. But you want to identify those lucky breaks and root out those safety shortcuts that are lurking in your system. I surfaced with no problems, but I hadn't planned for how much heavy current was going to affect my air consumption, how the visibility would affect my stress levels, and I used up most of my air buffer. So if something had gone wrong, I would have been in serious trouble. Sharing that kind of thought process with other people allows them to understand what kind of factors. Oh, looking at current and visibility and using that to tweak how much air I'm planning, building that judgment. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about today is success. In diving, the best rescue is the one that you didn't have to do at all. First, you struggle, and someone might need to rescue you, and then you learn how to do the rescues. But the best part is when you gain the judgment to avoid those situations in the first place, to make that situation safe, so rescue isn't needed. The best incident response is when you don't have an incident, right? When you develop the judgment to avoid those things, when you say, honestly, this makes me a little bit uncomfortable, so I'm going to change that, or let's try this out first. Our culture has a tendency to reward heroic action, but that's based on a response to failure. And it's really important to recognize that real success is in a job well done, quietly, without incident, day after day. When a failover is boring and routine, that usually goes unrecognized. When was the last time that you bought pizza for the team and sent them home 2 hours early because of a lack of failure, right? But we do the opposite all the time. We buy them pizza and we keep them late, and then we send out an email that says, good job, team. We need to remember to be rewarding successes, especially the ones that are boring and safe, and notice those. If you're interested in learning more about normalization of deviance and complex systems, how they fail, here's some links to get started. I'll be sharing these slides from Twitter after my talk. I hope that I gave you some concrete suggestions today to make the work that you do a little bit safer. There's a lot more that I didn't get to fit into this presentation. I could talk about it all day. So if you have any questions, find me on Twitter. Thank you very much.